Good afternoon and welcome to the American Dream Reconsidered Conference at Roosevelt University. Once again, I would like to offer special thanks to our sponsor, title sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, and our supporting sponsor, Huntington Bank. Today, we are honored to bring you a conversation with Lori Lightfoot, the 56th mayor of Chicago, the first Black woman and first openly gay mayor of Chicago. Mayor Lightfoot's election occurred at an auspicious time, as cities and the nation have been grappling with a worsening wealth gap that has left many people behind. If that were not a large enough problem with which to contend, the COVID-19 pandemic and recent protests against racial injustice, especially with regard to policing, have created enormous challenges for elected officials. Over the course of this week's conference, we have listened to sessions that have emphasized the need for deep and sustained citizen engagement. For our opening conversation with another mayor, Mayor Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi, to our panel of Black women and the fight for democracy, and our session focused on LGBTQ rights, we have heard stories of pain and injustice, but also hope. The path before us will not be easy to traverse, but we understand where we need to go to make the American dream a reality for all Americans. On the 75th anniversary of our founding, Roosevelt University remains committed to its tradition of social justice and civic engagement. We are proud of the many Roosevelt and Robert Morris alumni, such as former Chicago Mayor Harold Washington, current Aurora Mayor Richard Irvin, United States Representatives Bobby Rush, Melissa Bean, and Mike Quigley, Illinois State Representative Dan Diedich, Chicago City Treasurer Melissa Conyers-Irvin, and Librarian of Congress Carla Hayden, who have all dedicated themselves to public service. Now, our presentation today will be moderated by the Honorable Judge Anne Claire Williams, who is no stranger to the American Dream Reconsidered Conference. Starting with our first year 5 years ago, and her interview with Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she has graced us with her experience and thoughtful presence. Anne Claire Williams is a retired United States Circuit Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and a former United States District Judge of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. American Bar Association called her, and I quote, a trailblazer and a leader. Indeed. So before we begin our session with Mayor Lightfoot, which will begin promptly at 2:15, I would like to ask Judge Williams to share a few words with us about the conference and her vision of the American dream.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here again. And why am I so excited? Why is this conference so special? Well, it's the mission of Roosevelt University. The rich history, the commitment to providing an opportunity for all students, regardless of race, religion, or sex. From the very beginning, Eleanor Roosevelt's dream and all the founders, that commitment to diversity and inclusion, standing up for minorities, people of color, first generation, those underrepresented students. That commitment, which has continued today, Mr. President, under your extraordinary leadership with your dedicated faculty, staff, and terrific students. And this conference every year is special because it examines that American dream every year from different angles, keeping it alive. That's why I was so honored to interview Justice Ruth Ginsburg and then former Attorney General Eric Holder. And that's why I keep coming back, as long as you'll ask me.
Judge Williams, you're always welcome back to Roosevelt University. And I will tell you that those two interviews that you mentioned with Justice Ginsburg and Eric Holder still resonate in our hallways, in the discussion with our students and with our faculty. So thank you so much for doing that. Now, we have many young people in our audience today. Now, what do you wish you had known when you were in college and starting to think about the kind of life you wanted to live?
Well, I wish I had known how important it is to look for and build relationships with faculty and to find mentors and good advisors. I went to Wayne State University in Detroit. I think the enrollment now is over 40,000. When I was there, it was over 35,000. I was kind of lost in the shuffle. I attended both day classes and night classes, which is just what you offer. I worked my way through school, paid my way working as a cashier in a supermarket, and then as a substitute teacher. I had two sisters at home, and my family couldn't afford for me to go away to school. So I rode the same bus I took to high school to college. And I didn't force myself during that experience to nurture relationships with good counselors and good faculty. I actually ended up changing my major 3 times. And that meant I had to pay for an extra semester. So, maybe just even, and I recognize a lot of your students are doing just what I was doing, but that professor that gives you an A or a B plus, that advisor that counsels you on your classes, maybe you're involved in a student organization, because I do encourage getting involved in a student organization and at some point during your career, giving back in some way to the community. Maybe it's a part-time work study judge. A part-time work study job that introduces you to others. But I think finding mentors, that was something I was not looking for, and I would do that differently.
Yeah, sage advice for our students, because going forward, will make their lives so much easier. Now, several of our panels during this week have discussed the contribution of Black women to democracy, and today's panel, of course, will represent that. What role do you see for Black women in public life as we move through this difficult period of economic inequality, a pandemic, and an intensified focus on racial injustice?
Well, from Harriet Tubman to Sojourner Truth to Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan and Constance Baker Motley, who's especially close to me, my mentor and the first African-American woman to serve on any federal district court. In fact, the first woman of color to serve on any court. All these giants led the way for us to follow as Black women. Black women have always been in the forefront of change, even in the suffrage movement when we had to walk in the back of the march because of the color of our skin. We spoke out, we stood up, and we did not give up. And when you see the number of Black women mayors, members of Congress, presidents of academic institutions, judges, leaders in the not-for-profit world, in communities rising to take their place in corporate suites, we know the impact Black women have had, and Black women will continue. We've been the backbone of the Black community. And in this time of pandemic, economic inequality, and like you said, the intense focus on racial justice, which it's about time, we will continue to stand and we will help find a way, and maybe with Kamala Harris leading the way.
Well, I am hoping, and I would love to see her as our first president of the United States after she finishes her term as vice president. But that's a conversation for another day.
Yes, it is.
Now, clearly you have achieved great success in your own career. What does the American dream mean to you? How would you define it? And what would you say to young people who feel that the American dream is more difficult to achieve today than perhaps in the past?
Well, the American dream, that all men are created equal and would be given equal opportunity, was not written for me. This country was stolen from the indigenous people and built with the blood, sweat, and tears of my ancestors, enslaved who were deemed 3/5 of a citizen. Women couldn't even vote. And the fight for justice, that fight for equality, has never ended. COVID-19 and the horrific murder of George Floyd and so many other Black people at the hands of the police has really ripped open the gaping wound in our society of systemic injustices. But the ideal of the American dream is still something that we as Black men and women always held on to and always worked toward. I agree with young people that it's very difficult to see that hope, to see how that American dream is achievable in these times. But many have sacrificed so we could get where we are. We stand on their shoulders. We can't give up. I think of my mom working midnights at a training school for delinquent children because she couldn't get a full-time job as a teacher in Detroit for 17 years because she was Black. Or my dad, who drove a bus for 20 years, both college degrees, worked their way through school driving a bus, my dad, because he was Black. Actually, I ended up in college taking classes with my dad when he quit his job as a bus driver because his white boss denied him a promotion. I asked Daddy, how could you stand it, Daddy, driving that bus for 20 years? Of course, I loved that he was a bus driver. He was so handsome in his uniform. And in those days, and the students won't know this, bus drivers had real money, dimes and quarters. And so at the end of the line, I could roll up the dimes and quarters. I could watch the men play dominoes. And it wasn't until we were I was in a class and he was in college with me, and someone said, who do you admire most in your life? And I started talking about my father, and tears started rolling down my cheeks. And I went home and said, Daddy, how could you stand it? You were a bus driver for 20 years and you had a college degree. Why aren't you burning down the city of Detroit? And he said, no one could take my education from me. That is mine. I earned it. Number one. Two, being a bus driver is good, honest, decent work. Never forget that. Number three, he wanted to make the world better for us, to carve a path for us, to give us opportunities he didn't have. And then my father's degree was in psychology and political science, and he was very funny. And he said, number four, I used a lot of psychology with the people on the bus. So I feel like a blessed child, and I think about the students that you have that come from a whole variety of places, you know, whose people may have been running from oppression in Mexico, who may have come from starvation and pestilence in different African countries, who are all standing on the shoulders of someone, a relative, a grandmother, a mother, a father, a teacher, maybe a minister, an adopted parent. Someone believed in you, believed that you could go to Roosevelt University and you could graduate. Someone touched your life and gave you hope and let you realize you could achieve your dream. And so I think if you think about that, those who've gone before you, and you think about the road they had to travel, because, you know, we can go back even further. I could have been a slave. I could have been picking cotton. Even though there's so much we need to do, there has been much progress. And so you're here because someone cared about you, cared about your future, and felt that you too could achieve the American dream and get a great education and go on and have a good life.
Wow. You are such an inspiration to all of us, and of course our students, as they navigate their way to, for their future. Now, in some of the conversations that I have had with you, you are allegedly retired.
Yeah.
A list of activities, especially nonprofit activities and training that you do across the globe. So if you give us just a brief synopsis of that, I think our audience would appreciate that.
So I think I mentioned that I started out as a teacher, and I think I'm just a teacher at heart. It's just the joy of seeing someone learn and knowing that you've played a small part in them getting to be who they are. And so I was always a doer and a joiner. My dad was asked one time, did she always have her hands in everything? And Daddy said, well, yes, she was in the Glee Club. She was a service girl. She was a volunteer working with students. She was on the school newspaper. I was one of those people that always wanted to get involved. And I think that also came from my parents, because they would take me to civil rights marches, and they were big on contributing to the community. They were engaged in the community. And so I carried that with me in law school, and volunteered to work with young elementary students. I can remember acting out Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and Goldilocks was prosecuted for breaking in their house. I mean, and then from then on, after I graduated from law school, I started after I tried some cases, started training lawyers, prosecutors, training at Northwestern Law School, and then to Harvard, and training new federal judges, including Justice Sotomayor. That's how I actually met her. And I always felt that I needed to make that contribution, because I felt so blessed that I had received. And to me, when you get great blessings, you have a great responsibility to give back. So that didn't change. So I graduated from law school. I was involved in a lot of activities in law school. And then once I became a lawyer, even as a baby lawyer, I started a not-for-profit, Minority Legal Education Resources, Inc., to help people pass the bar. And now we've had almost, I want to say, between 4,000 and 5,000 people pass the bar. And we opened it up to all students. And now all the Chicago area law schools, and particularly students of color, come through that program and pass the bar at a rate equal to the normal pass rate. Why do I say that? I was just 2 years out of law school. I was a baby lawyer. Okay. I say that to say the power of one, because I went to a professor that was running a small course like that, asked him if he could extend it. He said no. I said, well, what if I get my friends and you train us, and we bring a group of students that are not from Northwestern, and they pass the bar at the same rate? Can we talk? And that's what we did. So I use that example, not because I'm so special or anything, but just to show the power of one. So when you have an idea, and you're strategic, and you make a plan in terms of what the goal is, and you get people, a lot of other ones, to join with you, you can affect change. And that's the attitude I've had throughout my career. So I've actually founded 2 other organizations of Black women lawyers, and Just the Beginning, that focuses on young people and encouraging them to become lawyers. And I've also been engaged in a lot of activities. And now I've been going to Africa since 2001, and training judges, lawyers, and others in advocacy, ethics, and then training them to be trainers, because I want to work myself out of a job, President Ali.
It is, again, very hard for me to believe the word retirement attached to you and what you do every day. And you just mentioned at least 5,000 lawyers, young lawyers being trained. Unbelievable. Yes. Well, I see that Mayor Lightfoot has entered the room. Welcome.
My pleasure.
We are so honored to have you at Roosevelt University. Now, at this moment, let me ask the Honorable Judge Williams to take over and moderate the session. The Honorable Maury Lightfoot, the 56th Mayor of the great city of Chicago. Judge Williams.
Thank you so much, President Ali. Thank you to Roosevelt University for inviting me. Principles, courage, and grit. A willingness to be the first, a commitment to social justice. That's what Roosevelt was built on 75 years ago. And there's no one better than our mayor, who embodies principle, courage, and grit. One of the most influential major mayors in the country, facing some of the most difficult challenges of our lifetime. That's why I'm so honored, Mayor, that you joined us today. I've known and admired you since you were an assistant U.S. attorney, and I was a federal judge, and I welcome you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And Judge, you know this, but you were such an inspiration for me and so many others because of the trailblazing work that you have done and the way that you were always looking to bring the next generation along. So I thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be with you here today.
And you know, Mayor, you were not born, or your first dream was not to be a mayor.
No.
But your whole life, it seems to me, you've been preparing to lead. And so let's talk about that early influence that your family had. You were the youngest of 4 children. Your dad wanted to be a lawyer. And I love that quote of your mother. She's the shortest of my children, but has never allowed height to go up against anything he feels is not right. So how did your family shape you into being a leader?
Well, you know, my father not only worked unbelievably hard, and the picture of me, I'm standing in front of my dad's old station wagon, which I'm sure was probably, we were probably like the 5th or 6th owner, because we never owned a new car my entire growing up years. The first time I owned a new car was in 2004. But I watched my father work very, very hard to really be the man that he wanted to be despite a lot of odds. And my father was deaf, as I know you know, and just watching the discrimination that he faced, whether overtly or just a lack of really understanding of how difficult it was to be disabled, and particularly in a hearing world. So I felt early on and really kind of witnessed injustice and discrimination. You know, and I grew up at a time when racial discrimination was very much still a part of the table, on the table. There were things that I knew I couldn't do, places I couldn't go as a young person because of my race, even in my small town. So it made me feel that injustice and discrimination personally, and made me want to be a fighter. And my mother in particular is a huge fighter. There was no one that she wouldn't go toe to toe with. She was not cowed by anyone. And even to this day, she's just celebrated her 92nd birthday. She's the kind of person that if she sees something wrong, she's not going to hesitate to speak up about it. So seeing my father's experience and also having my mother's DNA to be a fighter, that's really, I think, shaped me early on.
And so the lessons you learned from them were very helpful to you as you were in school and you were a leader, even in high school.
Yes.
It's so interesting that you ran for class president, won 3 times, and you had that slogan, "Get on the right foot with Lightfoot."
Yes.
Your mayoral slogan, "Bring in the light." So it was a primarily white community, and you talked about the strength that they gave you. So let's move on to your college days and your law school days. You were very successful. So what tips or advice do you have for our students who are listening?
Well, I think a couple of things. If I look back on my younger self, you know, I was academically always very, very successful. But when I got to college, I became a little more fearful. And I didn't take a lot of risk. I was afraid of failure. And I look back on that time and think I should have pushed myself more to do more and really take more advantage of the opportunities that were there in front of me at University of Michigan. So I would just say, when you're you know, in your late teens and you're in your 20s, that's a time to take risk and really push yourself and find out a lot about who you are and what you're made of. I was kind of on this path to finish college. College was a struggle for me, mostly because of finances, and I had to do a lot of work study just to be able to stay in semester to semester. But I really, if you have the luxury to really push yourself to take risks, just even in the classes that you select. Your life isn't set when you're in college. And so, life has worked out well for me, but I do, looking back on that time, wish I had done more to really kind of push myself and just explore academically in other ways.
Well, certainly that wish to explore carried on in the various jobs and positions you held during your life.
Yes.
Let's look at that variety of experiences: litigator, federal prosecutor, president of the police board. So I don't really want to focus on that, but I want to focus on the next slide, because you've always found the time to give back. Why is that so important?
I'll hearken back to a comment that former Chief Judge Ruben Castillo made at an event. And he talked about the fact that in Chicago, we have a rich history of lawyers being very much involved on a range of different causes. And that as lawyers, we're really uniquely qualified to bring our skill set to issues of importance to public discourse. And I've thought a lot about that, and I kind of knew that intuitively, but his words really crystallized that for me. One, I just felt like I wanted to be involved and engaged. Being a lawyer is one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done. I take great pride in being a lawyer, but I also believe that there are a lot of really good causes out there that could really use the talent and experience of lawyers. And candidly, working in a big firm, I just determined, whether it was through my pro bono activities or my board memberships, that I was going to leverage the firm's platform to really help causes and constituents that I cared a lot about.
I think it's a lesson to the students as well. And it positioned you to that very big day, May 20th, when you became mayor of our great city. Beautiful shot of you and your family in the next slide. So how did you feel in that moment? The first openly gay Black female mayor of Chicago.
Well, I remember we were kind of cloistered in a room off stage. And when our time came, and walking out onto that stage and seeing that crowd, it was very surreal. A lot had happened from the time that I announced in May of 18, and there I'm standing there literally almost a year later to the day. I felt overwhelmed with joy. I was so happy that my family was there, and particularly my mother was there to see it. But I also realized the awesome responsibility that came with taking that oath. And it was really, it was such an amazing experience for me, and surreal, but I was also ready to get to work. I enjoyed Inauguration Day, but I was really happy to start that next day and actually start getting to the business of governing. Somehow I think I've lost the audio feed, Judge.
I think
there you are.
You had no idea what was to come.
No, certainly not. Certainly not.
And one of your big focuses, and that was even on that day, the war on poverty. So you put together that STEP program. Everyone can see the components. Your quote: "If we don't do something now, I fear we're going to lose another generation of kids." Why was that a driving force for you?
Well, I had spent so much time going to different neighborhoods across the city and seeing kids that I saw myself in and really taking them with me as I left. You know, when you go into neighborhoods and you see people living in really challenging circumstances, and just also thinking about, you know, what do we need to do to turn around the violence in the city? What's really going on here? All roads lead to poverty. Life expectancy gaps, health disparities, jobs, and violence, and the list goes on and on. Educational attainment, the culprit bringing down all those things for poor people, and particularly for people of color, it's poverty. You know, you think about poverty as the absence of. It's all those things that we know are absolutely essential to create vibrant, healthy neighborhoods, but more to the point, to give people the tools that they need from the earliest age possible to realize their God-given talent. Here's the thing that I think people don't think about, and I always try to emphasize. Poverty is not cost-free. We pay for our neglect. It shows up in emergency rooms. It shows up in early deaths. It shows up in the amount of social services interventions that we really have to inject into communities every year. You know, I think there's a moral imperative to do something about it, but even if you just want to look at the dollars and cents of it, it is so much smarter, and you get a bigger return on your investment when you invest in people's lives at the earliest possible stage, rather than waiting till later and then realizing, oh, we've got a significant problem on our hands. So for all these reasons, I know that we must do something to turn around the fortunes of people in these neighborhoods who are really struggling under the yoke of poverty. And to put a finer point on it, myself and my team, we've been really thinking a lot about creating Black wealth. But on the other end of that spectrum, really looking at what is happening with Black boys in our city and what is driving them to the corners to man somebody else's drug spot. I want our young Black and brown boys coming into manhood to realize that their destiny isn't preordained, that they'll be in jail, they'll be on somebody's corner spot, or they'll be dead before their time. We can't do that if we don't attack poverty.
No, I agree with you 100%. And the passion with which you speak on this issue was only heightened when we dealt with COVID-19, which showed the crushing need. And when we look at these statistics in Illinois, when we look at the mortality and morbidity tables, as you said, this pandemic has shown our strengths, but also profound vulnerabilities that just highlighted it. I think it just ripped the Band-Aid off of it. And so one of the things that you did in dealing with this was you had a plan. You had a plan. And you said on the next slide, COVID-19 demanded that we realize just how connected we are and how much impact we have in each other's lives. And your goal has been to bring us all together to deal with this as a city. When we go to the next slide, your recovery plan, I thought you might comment on it because there's a lot of meat in this. And I don't think the people realize how much work you all have been working 24/7 on this. All those press conferences you had, forming all those really meaningful committees. Could you share with us why it matters so much to have a plan that will help these communities that are desperately needing help?
Well, you'll appreciate this. You know, I like to think of myself as an old trial lawyer. And anyone that you learn trial advocacy for, the word preparation comes through over and over again. And back in April, as we were hoping that we would start to see the curve start to bend in the right direction, we started thinking about, well, what is this going to mean for us? Understanding the impact of COVID-19, but also looking ahead to understand what we needed to do as a city to recover and heal. And the thing that I'm most proud of is we didn't just narrowly focus on the economic impact of COVID-19. We looked at a whole array of impacts, from trauma, challenges, mental health, and impacts on not just the big companies, but all the smaller companies as well, businesses that we call micro businesses, employing four people or less, but also community-based organizations, which are so critically important to delivery of services. Our safety net lies in those kinds of community-based organizations. So we really brought together 10 separate sectors, looking at all aspects of who we are, Chicago, measuring the impacts, and then making very specific recommendations for the future. At the time, and maybe still, we were the first city in the country to come up with a blueprint for how we recover. And that was important to me because a lot of people were fearful that the big plans and vision that we had for the city and making sure that we were investing in an equitable and inclusive way, that those would be sidetracked, or we would say, that's a luxury we now no longer can afford. I wanted to make sure that we had a plan and loudly and clearly continue to speak our values as we move forward to bring the city out of the economic impacts of COVID-19.
Complicated, and when we turn to at least one aspect of it, because you were a big proponent of masks right from the beginning. Let's look at that first question posed by a student. You know how mask mandates are points of contention, people are arguing about civil liberties. Is that legitimate, and how do we balance these concerns with the public?
About the decisions that we've had to make during this pandemic have been easy. And I want to be very, very clear. COVID-19 is not in our past. It is very much part of our present. I start every single day on a call, and the first voice that I hear is our public health commissioner telling us what the daily count is, the daily count of new cases and the daily count of deaths. So it's a stark reminder every day for me that COVID-19 is part of our present. We know that this virus is unpredictable. We know that it's taken very definite twists and turns. The only constants that we have right now to protect ourselves are the public health guidance. And wearing masks is critically important. Now, I'm not one who thinks that we should spend our police department's time fining people, or in some instances arresting people, as it's happened in other countries, for not wearing masks. But I do know masks make an enormous difference. I don't step out of my house, not even for a second, without wearing a face covering of some sort, because I know that it makes a difference in saving people's lives. And if you look at other parts of the country that have not embraced the public health guidance, the social distancing, the mask wearing in public, the death count is disproportionately high. It's real. And so until there is a viable vaccine, and that vaccine is not only available, but people are actually getting vaccinated, that's a whole nother discussion. We have to do what we know works. You heard testimony yesterday from Dr. Redfield, the head of the Centers for Disease Control, who said very clearly, we have to wear masks. Masks work. Masks save lives. It's unfortunate that this issue has been politicized as somehow an infringement upon people's liberties. No, we're just trying to keep you alive.
And you've talked about your plan and the plan to go forward. So of course, part of that is what the next student asked about making sure that you try to address tourism, which of course has gone down in this city like other cities.
So tourism is a big feature of our recovery plan. We were very hard hit when things started to close down, conventions started to get canceled. I mean, it's taken a huge economic toll, no question about it. But we're starting to see glimmers of hope. So for example, last weekend, and it's just one weekend, our hotels in the downtown area had 46% occupancy. Keep in mind, at the height of the COVID shutdowns, it was in the single digits. So we're starting to see people come back. The biggest difference maker, though, is going to be business travel, which is virtually non-existent at this point. But I think we'll get there, but we've got to remain diligent. We're not going to see a full turnaround, I think, in tourism until sometime deep into 2021. But what we are seeing is people are taking car trips. And in the Midwest, Chicago is the Mecca. We offer more variety and experiences. And what I know is people just want to get away. They want to have some taste of what their life, pre-COVID looked like. And so there are still opportunities for them available in a city like Chicago. Just seeing our beautiful lake, our incredible skyline, Millennium Park. They're still shopping, obviously, on Michigan Avenue. And that while our restaurants are struggling, there's still a lot that they offer. And we've tried to, and I think we've been largely successful, to kind of create this kind of our outdoor marketplace and festival feeling with the road closures all across the city that have allowed people to really dine al fresco, but do it in a very festive way. So we are still offering a lot for your tourist dollar, particularly if you're going to get in a car and drive anywhere, come to Chicago.
Absolutely. And when we turn to the next slide, of course, one of the students couldn't resist Cora to say, "How do you like being the mean queen?"
You know what? I've had a lot of fun with it, and really, our family and I think our staff have as well. What it showed to me was people wanted to have a distraction from the darkness of the moment, and what you saw was an incredible ingenuity. I've shown up in all kinds of places. I think the one with me standing in front of the police line, that showed up early on when we shut down the lakefront, and then it just took off from there. And we had fun with it. Obviously, we launched a couple different campaigns around stay home, save lives. So it was fun, definitely fun. And I'll give you a little teaser, more to come.
So we have to have some lightness and some hope in this to help carry us through. And we're moving now to something where the darkness in terms of the horrific murder and systemic injustice and what the George Floyd murder did. As you said, it brought us back to the original sin of racism, or COVID-16. What impact did that have on you personally, Mayor, and in your role as mayor?
Well, personally, it was really hard. There was a doctor who did a long piece. I can't remember now if it was in the New York Times or maybe the Atlantic, but he diagnosed and broke apart the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the video and did it in a very clinical but very stark way, and talking about what George Floyd's body was experiencing as he was slowly dying on that street corner. And it is so devastating to read. But it was something that was brought to my attention by one of my deputy mayors. And when you see that video and you see Officer Chauvin lean in even further at one point, putting more pressure on George Floyd's neck. You know, as a black woman, as a sister of two black brothers, you know, in my extended family, you can't help but take it personally. And just as another human being, watching the brutality and senselessness of what happened, it's devastating. You know, and as a mayor, it's been challenging dealing with the aftermath from a host of reasons. It's not only the civic uprising that happened in the aftermath of that murder. I believe it happened on a Tuesday, and by that weekend, our whole country exploded. We experienced it here, righteous protests, embedded in that vigilantes, and then the looting that happened all over the country, dealing with the continued protest, the confrontation between protesters and police. It unleashed a series of difficult issues and questions that had been there. They weren't new, but they were now front and center. They needed to be confronted. And I will tell you that my approach, I think different than some other mayors across the country, I felt like we needed to listen, not just react, certainly not pander, but to really listen and hear out the protesters that were in the street, hear out our young people who were really forcing us, and appropriately so, to reckon with the original sin of slavery and all the cascading consequences that had metastasized into things like systemic racism, segregation, deprivation of resources, and all the poverty-related symptoms. There's a direct line between that and slavery and how black people have been treated and viewed and denied throughout our history. So dealing with that, in many ways, there's no separation for me as what I felt personally from what I felt as a mayor. Being a black woman, growing up, both my parents were born in the 1920s in the segregated South, and listening to my father in particular talk about the brutality of racism that he experienced his growing up years down in Arkansas. It's about time that we are reckoning with this. So the things that I have tried to do in my short tenure as mayor to address these systemic problems and systemic racism and the absence of seeing the totality of our city and our neighborhoods where black and brown people live, that's a start, but only a start. And so we have to challenge ourselves to do much more and really look at this moment as a real opportunity.
Look at this moment, as you said, more than a moment. This is a movement toward justice. And if we look at the next slide, you were a leader, and we're not going to go into that plan. Everybody can see what that plan was based on, of more than 1,400 mayors, police reform and social justice, a blueprint of recommendations, because of course it's helpful if mayors can be on the same page and have similar goals. And then moving to Chicago, though, you had 4, when we look at the next slide, in terms of Chicago police reform, because obviously it's so critical. And 4 steps that you took there in terms of the budget for the consent decree, reforming the school resource officer program, looking at police contracts, reforming that, and that 90-day plan. Those were 4 key initiatives that you had in dealing with this problem. This challenge. Let's go to the next slide. And then I think, because you are also doing those things, but then looking toward the future. So hiring, civilian oversight, juvenile justice support, police licensing. And one of the statements you made So I want that slide to remain so everybody can see what your goals are and the touchstones are of your program had to do with funding of the police. A well-resourced police department remains critical as we attend to other needs of the community. And with the budget shortfall that you have, Mayor, how does that impact your approach to police reform?
Well, it's exactly the same. If you shortchange reform, you're shortchanging your future. You're shortchanging communities. And while I absolutely understand some people believe that a police department can never be reformed, but in my conversations that I've had with people who've kind of signed on to the defund hashtag, I provocatively say, all right, Ms. Alderman or Mr. Alderman, are you really telling me that you don't want any policing in your ward? Because if you don't, I can make that happen like that. And to a person, they always say, no, that's not what I'm talking about. But really what this goes back to kind of one of the themes of this conversation. People are sick and tired of playing second fiddle and not getting the resources that they need to create healthy, strong, vibrant communities. And I agree with that 100%. And what we also know is that there is more to creating public safety than just sending in the police. And I agree with that and been an advocate for that because I've turned around the police first and only strategy to public safety. I said from day one of my term as mayor, what's going on in our communities is a public health crisis. And in a public health crisis, you look at the root cause. The root cause of violence is poverty. The root cause of violence is the absence of real, meaningful economic opportunity in these neighborhoods. And I meant what I said before. We've got to create real structures in these neighborhoods so our black and brown young boys do not think that they have no future, that they don't have any hope. We've got to connect them up with hope, with a vision of themselves that is much larger than their current circumstances. And that's critically important. But meanwhile, we need to make sure that we have a police department that is well-trained in constitutional policing and de-escalation and making sure that they understand that a healthy, respectful partnership and relationship with the community is their most important tool. Not a gun, not a badge, not police powers, but working in partnership with a community that understands what their rights are too and has a heightened expectation around public safety.
Of your analysis, and let's go to the next page. We had a lot of questions by the students on this whole defund the police. And your position, I know, is not to defund the police, but to move those resources where they need to go and yet give the police what they need. So at this point, are you planning to reduce the $1 billion budget, as Ilya said?
What I always think is we got to be smart about the way in which we spend the money. And just by way of context, so the listeners understand, 90% of the police budget in Chicago, which is really true across the country, is personnel. Now, what does that mean? If we were literally to cut, because to meaningfully cut the police budget, you got to get below the 90% level. If you're going to meaningfully cut, it means you're cutting personnel. And if you're cutting personnel, you have to do that by reverse seniority. So what does that mean? In the last 10 years, the most diverse, the most well-trained police officers are our younger, more junior officers. So if you're going to defund, you're cutting the people who are generating most of the activity, who are most diverse, and the best trained. That's not the problem that we need to solve. It's quite the opposite. But fundamentally, I reject the notion that it's fund the police or fund the community. Absolutely, communities have been defunded. But the answer to that is to make sure we're spending the money wisely in the police department, having a conversation as we are right now about who should be the responder to a variety of different calls for service by the community, but also at the same time speaking our values by investing in communities.
We have a hard stop for you, and we recognize that and we respect that. And we know that you're focused on education. I just thought if we could show the slide, because of course there's so many inequities in our system. I know you have a program to try to get connectivity to kids who really need it. You have you're focused on education and what can be done in education. Let's go to the next slide, because there were some questions about the resources for education and how difficult that situation is. And even to the next slide, talking about teachers using outdated materials and spending money to pay out of their own pockets. So you're laser focused on this issue of education. Maybe a minute on that, because I want to save our last couple minutes to voting, Mayor.
So let me, I'm seeing a question here on the table. The teacher's contract that we resolved last year is the most lucrative contract in the history of CTU. At the end of the 5 years, the average teacher will make $100,000 a year or more. So let's just pause on that for a second. That's real dough. We have, for the first time, made a commitment, and we are working to get there, to place a social worker in every school. We are working hard to replenish our school nurses and our counselors. So if you look at the details of the contract that we negotiated, and it was a tough negotiation, as you know, that is a contract that is based on equity for our students, fairness for our teachers, and fairness for our staff. It is a very good contract. And we are living up to our end of the bargain. Even in these challenging times where we are educating our young people remotely, we're making sure that our values of equity and inclusion are being manifest themselves through the investments that we can continue to make.
That is such a significant and important issue. Gets back to what you said at the beginning, that you have to look holistically at this issue of poverty and how you address it. You also have programs for community engagement. We'll just go through the slides quickly just so we can get to voting. And this is money that you've allocated to rebuild hospitals. You have a community engagement plan where members of the community can give you feedback, because you want a plan that's going to work for everybody. And that's why that theme, We Will Chicago, is so important. And then I want to end on this voting point, because Mayor, every vote counts. And like you said, it's the most powerful form of democracy. Flip to the next slide. And there are things that young people can do. And so could you give us your word on that, Mayor, why this, to me, is the most important election of our lifetime?
Without a doubt, it will be the most consequential election of my lifetime, and probably all of our lifetimes. I really do feel like our democracy is under siege. And there's so much evidence, but let's just talk about the obvious one. Why are we meeting virtually? Why are our students not back in school? Why is our economy tanking? It's because of the failed leadership at the top. And I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but fundamentally, elections matter. 4 years ago, 100,000 people stayed home. People said, there's no real difference between the two candidates. Well, 4 years on, I hope the body of evidence as to why that sentiment was wrong is manifest. If we are going to turn around our country's fortunes, both for our residents and for our standing in the world, if we're going to make sure that we have resources to close the healthcare gap, the life expectancy gaps, to provide stimulus to local economies that have been devastated by COVID-19, to make sure that we've got a judiciary that is actually qualified and independent. If all the things that we care about, that you care about, this election will determine whether or not we get there, whether or not we come out of this dark time in a better place, or whether we see more of the same or worse. So make sure that you register, make sure that you have a plan for voting, whether it's by mail, whether it's early voting or it's same day. Make sure that everybody in your network is registered and plans to vote. No matter how you vote, you must vote. If you don't vote, you are giving away your power to somebody else. And as a Black woman, knowing the struggle that our people have had for way too long, to be able to just go and exercise the most powerful and important tool of democracy, do not stay home and not vote. Please, I beg of you, every vote matters. Up and down the ballot. We talk obviously a lot about the presidential race, but we've got a Senate race. I'm here in Illinois, and really consequential are those down ballot races for local elected officials, for judges, the people that are making those micro decisions every single day that affect directly your quality of life. They're on the ballot too. So our democracy is on the ballot November 3rd. Don't waste your opportunity to put your mark down on where you stand on the important issues of the day.
As you said in this final slide, if we could go to that, and we'll turn to President Ali, so that slide is up, how critical it is for those students' voices to be heard and to serve the public.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mayor Lightfoot and Judge Williams, for an inspiring and hopeful message. We look forward to having both of you on campus as soon as we can. Mayor Lightfoot, you have outlined a pathway that is inclusive and comprehensive, focusing on every neighborhood and individual in Chicago. We all must work together. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience and to our students for thoughtfully participated in today's conversation. Difficult questions provide opportunities for discussion and engagement. Now, a programming note: tonight we will hear from our students a panel titled "Speaking Truth to Power: Roosevelt Students Fight for Racial Justice." Thank you, everyone.